I still feel the cutting cold of that Siberian dawn when I close my eyes, because it was in that white and absolute silence that I finally understood. Nothing I knew about predators, military training, or survival applied to what hunted us in that endless wasteland. What we encountered in those frozen woods wasn't a wolf, wasn't a man, wasn't an experiment. And by the time you finish this story, you'll know exactly why the official military reports will never tell you what we really faced that night, when something with burning yellow eyes and impossible intelligence stalked 4 armed soldiers through the snow. Something that could think like a human but hunt like a beast. Something that shouldn't exist but left tracks in the snow that defied every law of nature. This is the true account of our encounter with a creature so terrifying that even now, months later, I can barely write its name. But I'm going to tell you everything, because some truths are too dangerous to stay buried in classified files. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and tell me where you watch this story from. The cutting cold of that Siberian dawn still pierces through me when I close my eyes, as if the fine snow that began falling again has remained trapped forever inside me, scraping beneath my skin like shards of frozen glass. It was in that white and absolute silence that everything began to crumble, and I finally understood that nothing I knew about predators, military training, or survival applied to what hunted us in that endless wasteland. We were conducting extreme climate survival exercises deep in the Siberian wilderness, miles from any civilization. The landscape stretched before us like a frozen ocean of white death, where temperatures dropped so low that exposed skin would freeze in minutes. Our breath crystallized instantly in the air, forming small clouds that disappeared into the vast nothingness around us. But something was wrong from the very beginning. The first thing that caught my attention that night was the unnatural silence. Even in that frozen desert, you could always hear something. Wind dragging dry snow across the ground, some lost bird calling in the distance, branches creaking under the weight of ice. But at that moment, everything fell into absolute stillness, as if the world had held its breath. I remember commenting to Kowalski that this didn't seem like weather, it seemed like predator behavior, the kind that makes everything go quiet before an attack. He just laughed, said I was seeing things, that I had watched too many documentaries about apex predators. But seconds later, the snow began to fall again, first in slow spaced flakes, then in thick, rapid bursts that created a white veil around us. And in the midst of that curtain of snow, we saw them, the tracks. Even now, I don't understand how we hadn't noticed them before. They weren't just large, they were disproportionate. The footprints were longer than my boots and wider than Sergei's hands, but the shape didn't match anything we knew. Elongated digits, claw marks, absurd depth, as if each step carried the weight of 2 men together. Yet the distance between steps was enormous, more than 1.5 meters, indicating bipedal movement. But the lateral drag marks revealed moments of quadrupedal motion, as if whatever made them changed posture mid-movement. Something completely impossible for any wolf or bear, especially in that region. The snow kept falling, and the silence grew heavier, more oppressive. It was as if the forest itself was warning us that we were no longer the apex predators in this frozen wasteland. We were being watched. The wind picked up, but not enough to blur the impossible evidence carved into the snow before us. Sergei knelt beside the clearest print, his face grave behind the frost-covered face mask. He was our tracker, a man who had spent his entire life reading the stories that creatures left behind in mud, sand, and snow. But this story made no sense. "Look at this," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind. He pointed to the heel of the print, then to what should have been toe marks. "The weight distribution is all wrong. This thing shifts its center of gravity, like it's changing body structure." Kowalski crouched beside him, comparing the print to his own boot. The difference was staggering. Where his boot left a clear, defined impression, this print seemed to have been made by something that pressed down with individual digits, each one ending in a sharp point that had penetrated deep into the packed snow. "Maybe it's wearing some kind of modified footwear," Kowalski suggested, but his voice lacked conviction. We all knew what modified footwear looked like, and this wasn't it. I followed the trail with my eyes, watching how it weaved between the sparse trees. The pattern was wrong, wrong in a way that made my survival instincts scream warnings I couldn't quite understand. Sometimes the prints were spaced like those of something running on two legs, covering ground with impossibly long strides. Then, without warning, they would shift to a four-legged gait, but the front paws were clearly different from the back ones. "Here," Yuri called from about 20 meters ahead. "Look at this." We approached cautiously, weapons ready. What he had found made my blood run cold. A section where whatever had made these tracks had stopped, turned in a complete circle, and then changed. The prints went from the familiar, impossible bipedal stride to something else entirely. Something that left claw marks in a pattern I had never seen before, too wide for a wolf, too narrow for a bear, but with the depth that suggested incredible strength. But it was what Sergei found next that truly unsettled us. Bark torn from a tree at about 8 feet high, ripped away in long strips that hung like frozen ribbons in the frigid air. The tears were clean, precise, made by something sharp and purposeful, but the height was wrong for any known predator in this region. "What kind of animal can reach that high and tear bark like that?" Kowalski asked, but we all knew the answer. No animal could. The temperature was dropping further, and our breath was forming ice crystals that fell like tiny diamonds in the pale light. But the cold wasn't our biggest concern anymore. Something had been here, something that didn't fit into any category we understood. And as we stood there studying the evidence of its presence, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was studying us right back. The first sound came from beneath us, a rumble so deep and resonant that I felt it in my bones before I heard it with my ears. We had been following the impossible trail for nearly an hour, when the ground itself seemed to vibrate with a growl that defied explanation. But this wasn't just any growl. Mixed within that bass rumble was something else, something vocal, almost articulated, as if a human throat were trying to form words from somewhere deep underground. The sound rolled through the frozen earth and up through our feet, making us all instinctively step back from where we had been standing. "What the hell was that?" Kowalski whispered, his rifle now firmly against his shoulder. None of us had an answer. The official who had been with us, Lieutenant Petrov, tried to maintain composure, suggesting it was just wind passing through hollow trees or perhaps some geological phenomenon common to permafrost regions. But when the actual wind picked up a few seconds later, the difference was brutal and unmistakable. Wind whistles, moans, howls through branches and gaps. This sound had intention, it had direction. It seemed to wound the air itself as it emerged from whatever depths had produced it. The sound came again, longer this time and closer. That guttural bass note was definitely organic, definitely from something with lungs and vocal cords. But the secondary tones, the almost words that seemed to ride on top of the growl, those belonged to something trying to communicate, something that understood language but couldn't quite form it properly. Sergei's face had gone pale beneath his winter gear. He held up his hand for silence, tilting his head like an animal trying to isolate a specific sound from background noise. When the rumbling came a third time, he nodded grimly. "It's not coming from below," he said quietly. "It's coming from ahead of us, but it's so low, so deep, that the sound is traveling through the ground faster than through the air. Whatever is making that noise has a chest cavity larger than a bear's." The implication hung in the frigid air between us like a death sentence. As if responding to our conversation, the sound came once more, but this time it was different. Higher in pitch, more clearly vocalized. If I had to describe it, I would say it sounded almost like someone trying to say, "here," but with a mouth full of fangs and a throat designed for howling rather than human speech. That was when we all realized the same terrible truth simultaneously. We were being called, summoned. Whatever was making these sounds knew we were there, knew we were following its trail, and was inviting us to continue, or warning us to turn back. The snow began falling harder, creating a curtain of white that reduced visibility to mere meters. But through that curtain, we could see something moving between the trees ahead of us, something large and dark that seemed to flow rather than walk. And those sounds kept coming, each one more articulated than the last, as if whatever was making them was learning to speak. Through the swirling snow and gathering dusk, we caught our first real glimpse of what had been stalking us. At first, It was just movement, a shifting darkness between the skeletal trees that seemed too fluid, too purposeful to be natural. But then the snow lessened for just a moment, creating a brief window of clarity in the white chaos around us. That's when I saw the eyes. 2 points of burning yellow light that seemed to absorb, rather than reflect, the pale illumination around us. They weren't the typical reflective shine you see from nocturnal animals caught in artificial light. These eyes glowed from within, like molten gold trapped behind glass, and they were positioned at a height that made no sense for any creature that should have been in these woods. Too high for a wolf, too high for even the largest bear, but moving in a way that suggested something trying to maintain an upright posture, despite not being entirely designed for it. "Do you see that?" I whispered to the others, not daring to speak louder. They saw it. We all saw it, but none of us wanted to acknowledge what we were looking at, because acknowledging it would mean accepting that our understanding of what was possible had just been shattered. The eyes moved as we moved, maintaining distance, but never losing sight of us. When we stopped, they stopped. When we tried to change direction, they shifted to keep us in view. This wasn't the random movement of a curious animal, or even the calculated hunt of a normal predator. This was surveillance, evaluation, intelligence. Through my night vision equipment, I could make out more details that I wished I couldn't see. The general shape was wrong, broad shoulders that were too wide for the torso, a head that seemed to sit on the neck at an angle that suggested it could turn much further than any normal skull would allow. The silhouette kept shifting, as if the creature couldn't decide whether it wanted to stand on 2 legs or 4. But those eyes never wavered. They remained fixed on us with an intensity that felt almost human in its focus, but utterly inhuman in its hunger. Kowalski raised his weapon, activating the infrared scope, and immediately jerked back as if he had been burned. "It's not giving off normal heat signatures," he reported, his voice tight with confusion and fear. "The thermal imaging shows something warm-blooded, but the distribution is all wrong. It's like the heat is concentrated in specific areas, while other parts are almost as cold as the surrounding environment." The wind picked up again, and through it came another of those impossible sounds, that deep, rumbling growl with its overlay of almost speech. But this time we could see where it was coming from. The creature's head tilted back slightly, mouth opening just enough to release that bone-deep vibration into the air. And in that brief moment when its mouth opened, I saw teeth that no earthly predator should possess. The snow began falling more heavily again, but those yellow eyes continued to burn through the white curtain, watching, waiting, and planning something that filled me with a terror more profound than anything I had ever experienced in combat. The creature didn't just observe us. It studied us with a calculating intelligence that made my skin crawl beneath the layers of winter gear. For nearly an hour, it maintained its position among the trees, those burning yellow eyes tracking our every movement, with the patience of something that had all the time in the world. But patience wasn't the most terrifying aspect of its behavior. It was the way it seemed to analyze each of us individually, its head turning slightly to focus on one soldier at a time, as if cataloging our strengths, our weaknesses, our fears. When those eyes fixed on me, I felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with the bitter Siberian wind cutting through my clothes. This wasn't how animals hunt. Even the most intelligent predators, wolves, big cats, bears, they react primarily on instinct, following patterns of behavior programmed into them by millennia of evolution. But this thing was thinking, planning, making decisions based on observation and analysis. "It's choosing," Sergei whispered, voicing what we all knew but didn't want to acknowledge. "It's deciding which one of us to take first." Petrov tried to maintain military composure, suggesting we establish a defensive perimeter and continue with our mission, but his voice betrayed the same growing unease that was consuming all of us. How do you establish a defense against something that understands tactics? The creature began to move then, not toward us but around us, maintaining that careful distance while slowly circling our position. Its movement was unlike anything I had seen before, sometimes upright, sometimes low to the ground, always fluid and silent despite its obvious size and weight. Through the snow I caught glimpses of its form, massive shoulders that suggested incredible strength, limbs that seemed too long for any normal predator, and that head, definitely lupine in shape but sized all wrong, too large, too intelligent in the way it held itself. But it was the sounds it made while circling us that truly unnerved me. Not constant vocalizations, but occasional rumbles and what I can only describe as contemplative huffs, as if it were having a conversation with itself about us. Planning, strategizing. "Look at the way it moves," Yuri observed, his sniper training allowing him to track the creature's progress better than the rest of us. "It's testing our reaction time, seeing how we respond to movement in different directions. It's learning our capabilities." The temperature had dropped even further, and our breath was creating clouds of vapor that froze instantly in the air. But somehow, I felt like the cold was the least of our problems. We were being hunted by something that combined the predatory instincts of a wild animal with the tactical thinking of a human adversary. And worst of all, it was taking its time, savoring the psychological aspect of the hunt, as much as it would undoubtedly savor the physical kill that was sure to follow. Through the swirling snow, those yellow eyes continued their patient vigil, and I realized with growing horror that we weren't just being watched, we were being toyed with. The attack came without warning, an explosion of movement that defied everything I knew about how large creatures move through space. One moment, the burning yellow eyes were maintaining their patient distance among the trees. The next, the creature launched itself toward us with a speed and agility that seemed to violate the laws of physics. But it wasn't the speed that paralyzed me with terror. It was the way it moved. The creature alternated between 2 legs and 4 legs so rapidly that my brain couldn't process what it was seeing. For a split second, it would be charging like a massive wolf, low to the ground with powerful hindquarters driving it forward. Then, without breaking stride, it would rise to an upright position, covering ground with impossibly long strides before dropping back to all fours again. The transition was seamless, fluid, as if its skeletal and muscular structure could reshape itself at will to accommodate whichever form of locomotion was most efficient for the terrain. "Open! Fire!" Petrov shouted, but his voice seemed to come from very far away. Sergei was the first to react, his rifle barking 3 quick shots that lit up the swirling snow with muzzle flashes. At least one of the rounds found its mark, striking the creature in the shoulder and sending up a spray of dark blood that steamed in the frigid air. But instead of dropping or fleeing like any normal animal would, the creature simply paused, still upright, and turned those burning eyes directly toward Sergei. The look it gave him wasn't animal rage, it was personal, offended, as if it had been insulted rather than wounded. That pause saved Kowalski's life. The creature had been heading straight for him, and I could see the trajectory would have brought those impossible claws directly across his throat. But Sergei's shot had interrupted the attack, giving us all a few precious seconds to understand what we were facing. The claws were the worst part. As the creature had charged, I had caught a clear glimpse of its front appendages. Whether you called them hands or paws depended on your perspective, but the claws were undeniably real. Curved, impossibly sharp, and long enough to disembowel a man with a single swipe. When it paused near a tree after being shot, those claws casually raked across the bark, and I watched in horror as they tore through the frozen wood like it was wet paper. Long strips of bark and wood curled away from the tree trunk, and the gouges left behind were deep enough to expose the pale heartwood beneath. "Jesus Christ," Yuri breathed. "What the hell is that thing?" But we didn't have time to analyze what we were seeing. The creature's pause was brief, just long, enough for it to assess the situation and plan its next move. When it looked back at us, there was something in those yellow eyes that chilled me more than the Siberian wind ever could. Intelligence, planning, and now, anger. It opened its mouth and released a sound that started as a roar but modulated into something that sounded almost like words, like it was trying to communicate its displeasure at being shot, trying to tell us exactly what it planned to do to us in return. The snow swirled around us, and somewhere in that white chaos, a creature that shouldn't exist was preparing for round 2. The sound that erupted from the creature's throat after Sergei's shot was unlike anything I had ever heard. It began as a roar, deep, primal, the kind of vocalization you might expect from an apex predator defending its territory. But as the sound continued, it began to modulate, to shape itself into something that sent ice through my veins. It was trying to speak. Not the random vocalizations of an intelligent animal like a dolphin or parrot, but deliberate, purposeful attempts at human speech. The roar became a howl, and the howl became something that sounded disturbingly like, "You ask will beat up pay." The words were distorted, filtered through a throat and mouth that weren't designed for human speech. But the intention was clear. This wasn't just an angry animal. It was a thinking being expressing its fury in terms we could understand. And that's when we opened fire. All of us, simultaneously, unleashing everything we had. The muzzle flashes illuminated the snow in strobing yellow light, creating a surreal battlefield where shadows danced and twisted with each shot. The sound was deafening in the thin air, a sustained thunder that rolled across the frozen landscape. I saw the bullets strike home. Dark blood sprayed across the white snow in patterns that painted a story of successful hits. Center mass, shoulder, what might have been the creature's left leg. Any normal predator would have gone down under that barrage, would have fled or died under the concentrated firepower of 4 trained soldiers. But it didn't fall. Instead, it seemed to absorb the impacts, staggering slightly but remaining upright, those burning yellow eyes never leaving us. The blood was real. I could see it steaming in the cold air, could smell the metallic scent carried by the wind. But whatever we were shooting at had a constitution that defied everything I knew about anatomy and mortality. Worse still, it was learning from our attack. As we continued firing, the creature began to move differently, not retreating but adapting. It would drop low when we aimed high, shift laterally when we tried to lead its movement. It was analyzing our tactics in real time and developing countermeasures. "It's not going down!" Kowalski screamed over the gunfire. "Why isn't it going down?" But even as he shouted the question, the creature was changing its strategy. Instead of pressing a direct assault, it began to circle us again, but faster now, using the trees and the swirling snow as cover. It was wounded, but not weakened, angry, but still tactical. And then I realized what it was doing. "It's trying to separate us," I yelled to the others. "It's herding us apart." The creature was using our own defensive instincts against us, positioning itself so that we had to split our attention and our firepower. When Yuri turned to track it to the left, Kowalski had to cover the right. When Sergei focused on what might have been movement directly ahead, Petrov had to watch the rear. We were being divided and conquered by something that understood military tactics as well as we did. The gunfire began to slow as we conserved ammunition, and in the relative quiet that followed, we could hear the creature moving through the snow around us. Not random movement, but purposeful positioning. It was getting ready for another attack, and this time it would be coordinated, planned, and devastatingly effective. In the distance, that impossible voice rose again, and this time the words were clearer, more human, and infinitely more terrifying. "One by one." The realization hit me like a physical blow. We weren't fighting an animal. We were engaged in tactical combat with something that understood strategy, something that could think several moves ahead and adapt its approach based on our responses. As our gunfire died down, the creature's movements became more purposeful, more coordinated. It wasn't simply circling us now. It was positioning itself to exploit weaknesses in our formation that it had identified during our initial exchange of fire. When Kowalski shifted slightly to get a better angle of fire, the creature immediately moved to take advantage of the gap he had left in our perimeter. When Sergei tried to advance to a position with better cover, those burning yellow eyes tracked the movement, and the creature adjusted its own position to maintain maximum tactical advantage. "It's reading us," Yuri said quietly, his sniper's training allowing him to recognize what was happening. "Every move we make, every decision, it's analyzing and countering." Petrov was finally beginning to understand that this wasn't a situation covered in any military manual. His face had gone pale behind his winter gear, and when he spoke, his voice carried the strain of a man whose worldview was being systematically destroyed. What kind of animal learns military tactics? The answer, of course, was that no animal could. But we weren't dealing with an animal, not entirely. We were facing something that combined predatory instincts with human-level intelligence, something that could hunt with the cunning of both species combined. The creature began testing our defenses in ways that made my skin crawl. It would approach from one direction until it drew our attention and weapons, then immediately retreat and probe from a different angle. It was mapping our response times, learning our individual capabilities, identifying which of us was the fastest to react and which was the most vulnerable. But the most unnerving aspect of its behavior was the way it seemed to be enjoying the process. Through the swirling snow, I caught glimpses of what might have been its face, and there was something in its expression that went beyond simple predatory focus. There was pleasure in the hunt, satisfaction in the challenge we presented. It was toying with us, the way a cat toys with a mouse, but with the added dimension of intellectual engagement. This creature didn't just want to kill us, it wanted to outsmart us first. "We need to change our approach," Sergei said, his tracker's instincts recognizing that we had become the hunted. "Staying defensive is playing into its hands. It's too smart for conventional tactics." But before any of us could respond to his observation, the creature made its next move. Instead of another probing attack, it simply disappeared. One moment we could track its movement through the trees, and the next it was gone, leaving only silence and the gentle whisper of falling snow. The silence was worse than the stalking. When we could see it, we could at least try to predict its behavior. But now it was out there somewhere, watching us from concealment, planning its next move while we stood exposed in the open. And in that moment of terrible quiet, I realized that the hunter had become the hunted, and our prey was far more dangerous than any of us had imagined possible. The attack came from directly above us. None of us had thought to look up, to consider that something that could alternate between bipedal and quadrupedal movement might also be capable of climbing. But as the snow swirled around us and we strained to locate our vanished stalker, it launched itself from the branches overhead, with the same fluid grace it had shown in its ground-based movement. For a split second, I saw it clearly silhouetted against the grey sky. Massive, bipedal arms extended with those impossible claws ready to tear into whatever it landed on. The sight was so shocking, so fundamentally wrong, that my brain struggled to process what I was seeing. But Yuri reacted faster than conscious thought. His hand was already on the flashbang grenade before the creature reached the halfway point of its descent. Military training took over where rational thought had failed, and he activated the device just as the creature was about to land among us. The explosion was blinding even through closed eyelids and winter goggles. The sound was deafening in the thin air, a crack of thunder that seemed to split the world apart. But most importantly, it caught the creature at the worst possible moment, suspended in mid-air with no way to avoid the burst of light and sound that erupted directly beneath it. The creature hit the ground hard, its perfect coordination disrupted by the sensory overload. For the first time since this nightmare began, it looked vulnerable, disoriented, struggling to regain the calculated control it had maintained throughout the encounter. We didn't waste the opportunity. All 4 weapons opened fire simultaneously, concentrating our shots on center mass and the creature's head. At this range, with the target momentarily disabled, every round found its mark. Dark blood sprayed across the snow in arterial patterns that told the story of multiple critical hits. The creature staggered, went down to one knee, and for a moment I thought it was over. But instead of falling, it looked up at us with those burning yellow eyes, and what I saw there made my blood freeze in my veins. It wasn't defeated. It wasn't even significantly weakened. It was impressed. The expression on its face, and it was definitely a face, disturbingly human despite its lupine features, conveyed a kind of professional respect for our tactical response, as if it approved of how we had handled the situation, as if it was pleased to be facing opponents who could present an actual challenge. But our concentrated fire was having an effect. Blood was flowing freely from multiple wounds, steaming in the cold air and creating a spreading stain in the snow around where the creature knelt. Its breathing was becoming labored, visible in the clouds of vapor that billowed from its elongated muzzle. Still, it didn't retreat. Instead, it slowly rose back to its feet, swaying slightly but maintaining that impossible bipedal stance. When it opened its mouth, the sound that emerged was different from its previous vocalizations. weaker, more strained, but somehow more human. "Good," it said, the word clear and unmistakable despite the obvious effort it took to form it. "Very good." And then it smiled, revealing teeth that no earthly predator should possess, and I realized that despite our successful defense, despite the blood and the wounds and the obvious damage we had inflicted, this thing was still in control of the situation. It was still hunting us. We had just made the game more interesting. What happened next defied everything I thought I knew about anatomy, biology, and the fundamental nature of living things. The creature, wounded and bleeding but still standing, began to make sounds that I initially mistook for death rattles, but as I listened more carefully, I realized they were something far more disturbing. The sounds were coming from inside its body, deep structural sounds like bones shifting, cartilage reforming, muscles and tendons stretching and contracting in patterns that no earthly creature should be capable of. "What is it doing?" Kowalski whispered, his rifle still trained on the swaying figure, but his voice filled with a confusion that matched my own. The creature was changing, not dramatically, not in the sudden, violent transformation you might see in a movie, but gradually, subtly, as if its body were a machine that could be adjusted and reconfigured for different purposes. Its shoulders, previously broad and powerful, began to narrow slightly. The elongated limbs seemed to contract, pulling closer to a more human proportion. Most disturbing of all, its face was shifting, the lupine features becoming less pronounced, more human with each passing moment. It was trying to become something smaller, something less threatening, something that might be able to escape. "It's trying to change into something we won't shoot," Sergei realized, his tracker's eye catching details that the rest of us missed. "Look at the way it's repositioning its weight, the way its posture is shifting. It's trying to make itself look more human." But the transformation was clearly difficult, painful, and incomplete. The creature, if it could still be called that, kept making those bone-deep structural sounds, and occasionally it would stop the process entirely, panting heavily as if the effort were exhausting. During one of these pauses, it looked directly at me, and what I saw in those yellow eyes made my chest tighten with an emotion I wasn't prepared for. Sadness. Desperate, overwhelming sadness. Not the simple pain of a wounded animal, but the complex grief of something that remembered being human, something that was trapped between two forms and couldn't quite achieve either one completely. "Don't," I said quietly, though I wasn't sure if I was addressing my fellow soldiers or the creature itself. But Yuri had already made his decision. His rifle cracked once, the shot taking the creature high in the chest and spinning it around. It went down hard, landing in the blood-stained snow with an impact that seemed to drive all the air from its lungs. The transformation stopped immediately. Whatever process had been occurring reversed itself rapidly, the creature's form snapping back to its original configuration like a rubber band released from tension. It lay there, breathing in short, sharp gasps, those yellow eyes beginning to dim. But even as it died, it continued to make those structural sounds, as if its body were still trying to decide what it wanted to be. And in its final moments it looked at each of us in turn, and I swear I saw recognition there. Not the recognition of prey identifying predators, but the recognition of one intelligence acknowledging others. It knew what it was dying as, and it remembered what it had once been. The creature's death was unlike anything I had witnessed in years of military service. Most things die quickly once the life leaves them, the light fades from their eyes, their body temperature begins to drop, and the inevitable process of decay begins almost immediately. But this thing died slowly, fighting every step of the way. Even after its breathing stopped, even after those impossible yellow eyes finally went dark, something continued to burn within it. I could see it through the thermal scope, heat concentrations that moved and shifted under its skin like liquid fire, as if whatever force had animated this impossible being was reluctant to let go. "The body temperature isn't dropping," Kowalski observed, checking his equipment to make sure it wasn't malfunctioning. "If anything, it's getting warmer." The snow around the creature began to melt, creating a spreading circle of dark earth that steamed in the frigid air. The metallic scent of blood mixed with something else, something organic but ancient, like the smell of deep caves or old forests. Sergei approached cautiously, his rifle still ready despite the obvious fact that the creature was dead. But when he knelt beside the body to examine it more closely, he immediately jerked back as if he had been burned. "Don't touch it," he warned. "There's something still happening inside, something that's not natural." Through the creature's thick fur, which I could now see was actually a mixture of coarse hair and something that looked almost like feathers, patterns of light seemed to move beneath the skin. Not the random firing of dying nerves, but organized, purposeful illumination, as if some internal system were still operating. "We need to get out of here," Petrov said, finally reasserting his authority now that the immediate threat had passed. "Whatever this thing is, it's not our problem anymore. We need to return to base and file a report." But I couldn't stop staring at the body. Even in death it seemed too large, too wrong for this world. The proportions that had looked merely unusual in life now appeared completely impossible. Limbs that were too long, joints that bent in ways that defied anatomy, muscle groups that served no function I could identify. And yet there were undeniably human elements mixed in with the bestial ones. The hands, despite their claws, had thumbs that could clearly manipulate tools. The skull, beneath its lupine features, showed signs of a cranial capacity that could house human-level intelligence. "What do you think it was?" Yuri asked quietly, voicing the question we were all thinking but afraid to ask. I didn't have an answer. Military training covers a lot of scenarios, but nothing in any manual had prepared us for this. We had killed something that shouldn't exist, something that combined the worst aspects of human intelligence with the predatory capabilities of an apex carnivore. The internal burning continued for nearly an hour before it finally began to fade. As the strange heat dissipated, the body began to shrink slightly, as if whatever had sustained its impossible size was finally leaving it. By the time the thermal signatures returned to normal, the creature looked smaller, more human, and infinitely more tragic. But even then, even in death, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't killed an animal. We had killed someone who had once been human and who had remembered just enough of what they used to be to feel the horror of what they had become. I can try to explain what we encountered in rational terms, can attempt to construct theories about unknown species or failed military experiments or mass hallucinations brought on by extreme cold and stress. I've spent months trying to convince myself that there must be some logical explanation for what happened in that frozen wilderness. But the only word that fits what we faced, the only term that encompasses the impossible combination of intelligence and savagery, of human and beast, of natural predator and supernatural nightmare, is one that I've been avoiding for months. Lycanthrope, shapeshifter, werewolf. Even writing the word makes my hands shake, because admitting what it was means admitting that everything I thought I knew about the world was wrong. It means accepting that there are things hunting in the dark places of the earth that science can't explain and military training can't prepare you for. But I know what I saw in that creature's eyes as it died. I know what I heard in its voice when it tried to speak, and I know what I felt when it looked at each of us with that heartbreaking mixture of hunger and humanity. It had been human once. Maybe it still was, in some twisted way. Maybe somewhere inside that impossible body, a human consciousness was trapped, forced to watch as its form was used for hunting and killing. Maybe that's why it seemed so sad in those final moments, not because it was dying, but because it was finally being released. The official reports will never reflect what actually happened. The incident has been classified, sanitized, explained away as an encounter with an unusually large and aggressive wolf. The blood samples disappeared, the photographs were declared too unclear to be useful, and the four of us were transferred to different units to prevent us from comparing stories. But I remember everything. The impossible, tracks in the snow, the sounds that were almost words, the intelligence behind those burning yellow eyes, the way it moved between forms as easily as changing clothes, the recognition in its dying gaze. I remember it all, and I know that somewhere out there, in the dark forests and empty places of the world, there are others like it, others who were once human and are now something else entirely, others who hunt with the cunning of people and the savagery of beasts. The Siberian wilderness taught me that monsters are real, that they walk among us, and that sometimes they remember what it was like to be human. That knowledge has changed me in ways I'm still discovering, has made me see shadows where others see empty spaces, hear howls in sounds that others dismiss as wind. I know what stalked us in that endless white wasteland, what we fought and killed in the swirling snow. The name for it exists in legends and folklore, in stories told around campfires and whispered warnings passed down through generations. It was a werewolf, and we survived its hunt only through luck, training, and the grace of whatever gods watch over. Soldiers in impossible situations. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls around my windows, I wonder if we really killed it at all, or if we just freed it to find a new form, a new identity, a new hunting ground where the prey might not be quite so well armed. The cold Siberian wind still cuts through me when I remember that night, still carries with it the scent of predator and prey, of human and beast, of the thin line between civilization and the darkness that lies just beyond the firelight. Some truths are too terrible to be believed, too dangerous to be widely known. But they remain truths nonetheless. Thank you for experiencing the Siberian encounter with us. If this tale of lycanthropic terror sent chills down your spine, please subscribe to our channel for more supernatural horror stories. Hit that like button if you enjoyed the spine-tingling journey, and share this video with fellow horror enthusiasts who appreciate tales of creatures that blur the line between human and beast. We'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Tell us what city or country you're watching from, and share any werewolf legends, unexplained, encounters or strange creature sightings from your own region. Have you ever heard tales of shapeshifters in your local folklore? Have you experienced something in the wilderness that defied explanation? Your stories fuel our passion for exploring the dark corners of human experience where reality meets nightmare. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss our latest explorations into the supernatural, the unexplained, and the terrifyingly possible. Until next time, keep watching the shadow, because you never know what might be watching you back.